Martin, I'm very excited to have you on the podcast, and we're going to be talking about an event which is coming up quite soon, where you're going to be giving a rendition of Dermot and Grania, The Pursuit Of. It's perhaps not a story that people know much about, so I thought we could start by you just introducing it and letting people know why you chosen this as a story to perform.
Thank you, Will. Well, it's definitely, I would say it's a story that chose me rather than I chose it, which is often the way with storytelling. You get so harassed or perplexed or confounded by a story, you realize the only way through it is to tell it, for it to live in your jaw a little. So I've probably been telling it for about 12 years. It isn't terribly well known, even within Britain and Ireland and Scotland, where you'd think it would have something of a fan base. It has something in common with a story called Tristan and Isolde, which folks know better, which is right down here, in Tintagel, just down the road. But it's a story of love. It's a story of aging. It's a story of obsession. It's a story of betrayal. And it's a story of twists and turns. You never know where it's going to land. And over the years, quite honestly, I have tackled it usually over anything between one whole day to three. I based a whole conference on Dermot and Grania. So this is the first time ever that the foolishness has so possessed me that I would sit down in front of a group of people and say, we will not leave this room till the thing is done. I have not done that before. The way that I work as a storyteller means traditional forms of rehearsal don't work. So what I'm having to say to everyone is, for God Almighty, bring a cushion to sit on, because the old benches can get hard after a few hours. Bring a hip flask, bring some, I think there will be a bar actually, but bring something comfortable, bring some chocolate. And at some point in the dark of a February night, it'll be done.
A storytelling lock-in, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. And so you say you've been telling it for 12 years. I'm interested in how. Well, I was going to ask you about memory. Obviously, if it can take a day to tell the story or 3 days, that's a huge amount of your personal memory there being used up. But also that it presumably it's developed, the way you've told it has developed over that 12 years. So yeah, how does that sound to you? I mean, is that true? Do you not need memory? Does it come to you?
We fetishize imagination, but without memory, imagination, is going endlessly in circles. It's funny, lockdown concerned me a little because I wasn't telling stories orally for about a year, and I was concerned that I would start to forget them. And in a way I did. In a way, the stories got hurt feelings because I didn't tell them. They went off in a huff. But the asset has been that the traditional trackways through it, I've had to reimagine. And in doing so, they've become much more vital and alive in themselves again. But Dermot and Grania has changed a lot over 12 years. Without giving the game away, the first few times I told it, especially the first, I got very ill afterwards. And the reason I got ill is there are parts of it that are extraordinarily difficult. This is not a story to bring a child to. And such was my sort of emotional and psychological investment in the telling of the tale. I leant in at certain moments that affected me physically afterwards. And I've learnt, rather like I'm not a bullfighter, but I'm a bit of a bull dancer, and the story is the bull. And you learn to make certain moves at certain times that mean you don't get gored by it. And so what I've learnt with Dermot and Grania is changes of gear, like driving in a car with a gear stick. And so, because you don't want to be, in bed for 4 days after you tell these things. So I've learnt where many of people listening will understand acupuncture, and they'll know they have points in their body that are particularly sensitive. Well, stories have acupuncture points as well for the teller. They have deep moments and wincing moments. And actually, the genius of oral storytelling is to be in a room where 60 for 400 or 500 people are having different pressure points activated through the telling. And to be in the presence of an oral storyteller is so different to a movie or the full enfleshment of a play, because the storyteller just gives you a skeleton, really. They just give you little sticks of language floating across a river, and your imagination has to do an enormous amount, which is often why people come out and go, God, I'm very stimulated, but I'm knackered. And the reason that you're knackered is your own imagination has had to be in full engagement, because what I've given you has been so sparse in comparison to the full flood of a movie.
Yeah, I'm interested in that, how we could link that to, well, hang on a sec, what's my question here? You were talking there about the sort of the effect of a story on the individual, on you as a storyteller, but also on the listener. And I'm interested in how we might zoom out a bit and look at it on a regional perspective, or a even broader perspective. And I believe Dermot and Grania is kind of an Irish myth, or of Irish origin. So presumably there's something we can think about in terms of, I don't know, regional consciousness, or this story has fed into that.
Yeah.
And then the idea of you bringing it here, to bringing it down to Devon, and what it means in that new context, in this new geographical setting, and I suppose time setting as well, obviously. Yeah.
Well, geography is everything to Dermot and Grania, because actually the pursuit, as you called it, the pursuit of Dermot and Grania by a character called Finn McCall, who's really, that you'd be hard pushed to find a greater hero in Irish myth than Finn. But this is Finn as an older man. It's not the Finn of his youth. It's Finn on the back foot. It's Finn witnessing something he never expected, which is seemingly the betrayal by one of his closest allies. And he sets out trying to find Dermot and Grania. But everywhere they go, wherever Dermot and Grania sleep, to this day, every now and then you find in Ireland something called Grania stones. And it's meant to be a place of great agricultural and spiritual health for the land. The image I gave you a minute ago was acupuncture points. And it's actually, as Dermot and Grania make their way through this triadic pursuit. It's interesting, if Dermot and Grania had just gone off together and eloped, I don't think there would have been the sufficient tension for the land itself to respond. But when you have that triad of Finn, Dermot and Grania, it's very, very different. Without Finn, the whole thing slackens off and they're just hippies in the forest. But with Finn, it's a taut ritual tension between obligation and romantic passion, which is something that comes up in these stories all the time. The societal obligation versus true love.
Right.
And Ireland itself, the country of Ireland, the land of Ireland, responds in kind to the breaking of a political marriage into a marriage that has real love at the center of it. Now, what else was I going to say about this? It's interesting for me, I have to say, bringing it to Devon, of course, is that this story is very Aboriginal for me. This is very much the story of my bloodline. You know, my DNA, such as it is, a lot of it circulates around an area called Connemara, and then slightly wider into, Galway, Mayo, Sligo, that area. So for me to tell this story is a very traditional story. It's a story actually of my people, even though interestingly, I did not know that when I started to tell it. I was just magnetically attracted to it. And so it's another thing for storytellers is when you begin to do a bit of work and figure out, oh, this has something to do with my essential nature. This story is telling me something about myself. So quite what will happen in Dartington, I do not know, other than it will be swimming around in the bloodstream, probably of a third of the people in the room.
Well, it remains to be seen. That'd be interesting. Yeah. And where will those people take it once they know it, or once they've reminded them?
Yes, but funnily enough, I mean, there are stories where I tell a story and people go away and they remember it. They just put it in their pocket. I could think of a story like the Foxwoman or Tatterhood or the Handless Maiden or many others. But this won't behave like that, I promise you. What will happen is they'll remember moments. They'll remember moments. And that's one of the things I always advise people when slightly overwhelmed with a story. I always say initially, don't fatigue yourself trying to remember the thing from beginning to end. Go back to an image in whose presence an effect was had. Your heart opened, you recoiled, something went on, and then work out of a particular image, and that will do the work. And then incrementally, by time, sometimes by repetition, the whole story comes. But this isn't, I must admit, a story you can just put in your pocket.
No, I'm sure it takes. Well, how do you go about? I mean, how do you go about learning? That'd be interesting to know. Where did you learn it from? Did you read it? Did you then kind of absorb it, and then? I suppose it's a form of translation that you're doing, but where from? And yeah, where from?
I knew a lot of stories from earlier on in Finn's life, which are generally sort of sweeter, more playful tales. But I knew this big, heavy thing happens later on. And I suppose, like most of us, you identify with stories that seem to be telling you something about the age that you are. And I realized 12 years ago, how old would I have been then? My late 30s, that, you know, round the corner was middle age. Round the corner was a very much a new era, which had deepening, but it also was going to introduce me to limits that I didn't have when I was younger. I would be perceived differently in the world, and that might hurt. So I think organically it was a story that had wisdom for me in it. It certainly a story that had counsel about not always acting on impulse. You know, there's a lot of wisdom in not always trusting your gut, because what sometimes we think of sometimes, I mean, it sounds peculiar to say don't trust your instincts, but you need to have a good relationship with your instincts to do that. First of all, I've said a few times recently that I think we get fake news from our own psyche. You know, that's how bad things have got. It's not just out there. There is such sort of spiritual derailment within us at this point. The still small voice that the mystics talk about could be very hard to access. And actually, we're just really in touch with our neurosis or various unsettled pains or fantasies. So get to know yourself well first. I'm interested in this notion of memory. The way I actually learn a story is a very peculiar detail. Stories, myths, like to see the teller work hard to recall them. It's as if as soon as you've told it, it swims away like a salmon, unless you go through the difficult labor of recalling it. I'm usually in the process most weeks of having to call a story towards me to tell at the weekend. And that requires dedication, it requires time. ideally I can find someone to tell it to, because as I might have mentioned, I can't rehearse in a traditional way. I don't just pace up and down a room. And the way the story comes out each time, although the A to B to C is the same, the way that I navigate that is always different. So there are very few set descriptions, because the reason I got into storytelling was not to be an entertainer. It was to work into a conversation with wildness. I've been a wilderness rites of passage guide for a quarter of a century. So I didn't want to turn out set pieces. I didn't want to create one-man shows. I wanted to enter a public situation and allow my imagination to unfurl there and then. Now that puts you under a lot of pressure. I mean, can you think about that for a second? I've got to walk into a room where everyone's paid money for quite a long period of time, recall a story that is far too long to be told in one night, and there's nothing settled on the tongue whatsoever, other than what I imagine in front of me at that time. I know it can be done because I've done it thousands of times already, but it's just storytelling, as you can imagine, Will, is a huge word. We use it in all sorts of ways, but in terms of what we call the oral tradition of storytelling, the storytellers that I find the most dazzling do that kind of tightrope walk. When I'm looking at them and I think, good Lord, this isn't a recital. This isn't a recital of something you've learned and therefore are rather, you're almost anesthetized to it. The language isn't going to bend or curve or do anything in response to the room. It's going to stay steady as an arrow, which is admirable. And some people do phenomenal jobs like that. It's just not for me.
I can see that. There's, as well as the scary aspect of not knowing what's going to happen, there's also a liberation from the text or something like that. I think that could be quite nice.
Yes, I mean, if we think of the oral tradition, as you know, at Dartington, I actually run an MA with Alice Oswald and Emma Bush, Bram Arnold, Tracy Waugh, where we look at both what we call the oral tradition and the kind of mythic literature tradition. And those stories are rather different. Stories that have a long inheritance on paper do something to the imagination that the earlier stories, they do something different. And Dermot and Grania does not have a definitive literary version. It's had Marie Heaney, I think, has had a crack at it. Lady Gregory has had a go, but there isn't. You're not dealing with a Homeric legacy. Yeah. I'm not dealing with like, oh God, everybody knows this happens at this point. And that's wonderful for a storyteller, because people come in with a rough idea, but they're not sitting there with their volume of Dermot and Grania on their knee saying he forgot to mention the marigolds on page 3.
Yeah, sure. No, that's great. I like that idea. Yeah. And you mentioned the masters. I wonder, will you teach this on the course?
Yes, this is a moment on the course where all the students will be in attendance. And I deliberately wanted to lift them out of the lecture hall, out of a daytime environment into a nighttime environment where the volume was turned up effectively, imaginatively and otherwise. So the students are there and I want them to see, okay, you've seen me telling stories in very intimate environments where I stop and I start and we ask questions. Let's see a proper, troublesome, big-fanged story prowling around the room and how a storyteller approaches that. That's what I want them to see. So primarily, that's why I'm doing this, is for the edification of my students. But I also thought this would be a great doorway for local folks who may be interested in what's happening at Dartington in general, with a whole bunch of courses, as you know, that have been launched and are very interesting. There's nothing I must say, there isn't anything like Poetics of Imagination in other places. By and large, these days, mythology is interpreted as a kind of old-time version of psychology. So what happens is, if you go to study myth, really you're studying something called depth psychology or archetypal psychology. And although we touch on that, we place oral tradition right at the center in a way that most of those academies don't. And we also have a sense of the anthropological and the ecological implications of the tales.
Fascinating. Yeah, I like that. It's a great, it's a very popular course, and I'm not surprised, because, as you say, there isn't another. I can't think of any other examples of that kind of course. All the others, if you do a straight literature course, you're going to be looking at the social context, the historical context of the literature, as you say, perhaps a psychological aspect of it, but not in the way that you've described. So that's great. We're running out of time, but I know we said we'd only talk for 20 minutes. But one thing that just sparked in my memory when you were talking, reminded me of a thing I heard Mark Rylance say once about Shakespeare. I think it was, what's the one he did, Richard III. And he said, I think he's said once that the interesting parts in drama are when the actors forget the lines and when mistakes happen, and how the actors can get back to a state of stability. And that seemed to be a bit like what you're describing. You're kind of putting yourself into a place of challenge, a difficult place, and it's how you can navigate that on the night, and which will make it so dramatic and fascinating for everyone watching.
That's exactly right. Mark and I actually did, I remember about 7 years ago, we did a story together at the Edinburgh Festival, in front of an enormous crowd, actually, that I'm sure was there for him rather than myself. But I'd found an East Anglian version of a fairy tale called Iron John, but with very different details. And Mark acted out various characters. Sometimes he was the daughter of a king, sometimes he was the king, sometimes he was a being from the bottom of a lake, as I was telling it. And our rehearsal time for that was precisely nothing.
Really?
You know, we walked out and just did it. And then, funnily enough, we ended up in the dressing room, and into the dressing room, believe it or not, came someone called the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who was a friend of Martin Luther King and part of the civil rights movement, and a huge kind of imagistic part of my youth. And he came over and he put his hand on my shoulder and was quite emotional and said, I hear you're the man. I really hear that I have to meet you. And I said, you think I'm Mark Rylance, don't you? He said, you're not. And I said, no, he's over there. Great stuff. And Mark is our greatest example of someone that always leans into danger.
Well, I hope everyone's going to lean into danger and join us. Thank you, Martin. It's been great chatting to you, and yeah, good luck on the night.